This is not merely AI fiction. This is an official cold case, a documentary on Louis Le Prince, the father of what he called moving pictures, a man who disappeared seemingly from the face of the earth on Tuesday, September 16th, 1890. This documentary is carefully reconstructed through archives and letters. We could make this a story about money, greed, patent wars and murder. But instead of sensationalizing, we chose to examine the theories, to test them, and to see if they could be disproved. And where others stop, believing they have reached a dead end, we continue the search after this documentary finishes. Along the railroad he once travelled, town by town, region by region. Through the records, through the books of France, to see if he might still be there. Enjoy the documentary. Most stories you hear online start with the same old narrative, a mystery retold so many times that the edges have worn smooth. But this time, Gianna decided to do things differently. She didn't echo headlines. She went straight to the source. Gianna dove headfirst into the archives of France, into dusty notarial ledgers, death registries, signatures curled in ink by hands now long gone. And what she handed me wasn't theory, it wasn't rumour, it was the raw truth, written down by the people who lived it. While others chased whispers, she followed the money. And that changed everything. Because once you follow the money, you begin to see things that rumours never tell you. Quiet transactions, unspoken loyalties, the moments where a person's heart is written not in letters, but in francs. What she uncovered was not the story of one man who disappeared, but a whole family, bound together by inheritance, ambition, and the silence between the lines. The story begins in the south of France, along the coast, in the warm sunlight of Montpellier. Jeannette Elisabeth Ricard lived there, married to Jean-Augustin Boulabert. On November 2nd, 1813, they welcomed a son, Pierre-François Adolphe Boulabert. 2.5 years later, on February 7th, 1816, their daughter Elisabeth Marie Antoinette Boulabert was born. There may have been other children, but their names don't shape this story. These two, Adolphe and Elisabeth, is where the real story begins. They were born into wealth and raised with privilege. And from what would unfold later, it's clear Elizabeth loved her brother deeply. Around 1838 or 1839, Elizabeth married Louis Abraham Ambroise Le Prince, a soldier, 16 years her senior. He was born on September 16th, 1799, and at the time of their marriage he was a captain in the 7th Regiment d'Artillerie, stationed in Bourges. So Elizabeth packed up her life in Montpellier, left her beloved family behind, and followed her husband to the centre of France. In 1839, the 7th was transferred to Metz, and it's there that Elizabeth gave birth to her first son, Louis-Auguste Albert Le Prince, on May 1st in 1840. Her second son, Louis-Aimé Augustin Le Prince, followed soon after and saw the first daylight on the 28th of August in 1841. These were her only children. In 1855, tragedy struck. Elizabeth's husband died. How exactly will remain a mystery. Gianna could not get into the military archives online, but she did find that his death was recorded on the 2nd of August in 1855. And after that, Elizabeth and her 2 children, one 15 and one 14 years of age, vanished from the paper trail for a while. She resurfaced years later in Paris on September 28th in 1867. She was living at 27 Boulevard Saint-Martin, a house that no longer exists today. She purchased a 4-story property in Paris on 6 Rue Bochard de Saron, a house of roughly 176.5 square meters, bought for the sum of 129,600 francs. The money likely came from an inheritance from her last living parent, and she reinvested it so she would always have a roof over her head. Today, that same address is chopped into overpriced apartments worth over 2 million euros. And the family who once lived there? They're not even on the deed. Back in Montpellier, Adolphe, now a 55-year-old bachelor, had turned his back on the law to follow his heart into painting. On January 30th, 1868, a loan was recorded in his name, 20,000 francs, lent by his sister Elizabeth. The loan was secured with her own home. Albert, her eldest son, was now ready to trade Paris in for Dijon. He married Marie-Gabrielle Agathe Chevreau in September 1868 on the 21st of that month. In the page-and-a-half announcement of this event, Gianna discovered a detail that had been missing until now. Albert's father, Louis Abraham Ambroise Le Prince, not only served in the 7th Regiment of Artillery, but died a hero's death. He had risen through the ranks to the position of Major, an honour that suggests not just duty, but distinction. It confirms what we had only suspected, that his service wasn't a short or symbolic one, but a career marked by valour, responsibility, and likely sacrifice on the battlefield. Cause of death? Still unknown, though. Across the ocean in England, Louis had begun making history. In September 1869, he married Sarah Elizabeth Whitley in Leeds. In the years that followed, Louis became the man that was the true inventor of the moving picture. While Edison's name took the credit, the first frames of cinema belonged to Louis Le Prince. The next entry in the archives appears on May 28, 1887. Elizabeth passed away at her home on 6 Rue Bochard de Saron in Paris at the age of 71. Her death certificate notes that Adolphe was present. It seems that by then the Boulabert siblings, brother and sister, were living under the same roof once again. Albert was on the other side of France. Louis was in the States or England. For reasons we may never know, Elizabeth chose not to move in with her eldest son, but instead stayed with her brother in the house she bought so many years ago. Within a month, Uncle Adolphe would be tending another funeral. This time for the family's colourful cousin, a renowned journalist in his time, a rebel with a cause that got him deported to New Caledonia. Every family has one. The one who burns too bright, speaks too loud, and refuses to fade quietly. His name was Jules Alphonse Boulabert. The house that once belonged to his sister was now in the hands of her sons, and Adolphe would remain within its walls, until his final days. Elizabeth died on the 28th of May, 1887. Whatever her sons may have felt in private, the official record shows that the family moved quickly into the legal procedures that followed her passing. In a household where responsibilities were divided and lives already stretched across countries, the succession had to be formalized before anything else could continue. On the 15th of July, barely 6 weeks after her death, Louis signed a document transferring his entire share of the family home to his brother Albert. He had no interest in the house since he lived in New York, and on top of that, Louis had debts to pay. For the rest of her life, Lizzie repeated the same line. "We were supposed to get 60,000 francs estate money." Yet no one had ever been able to track down the document behind that claim. This document, the one that confirmed Louis's transfer of the house to Albert, was not lost or destroyed. It was simply hiding in a place no one had ever thought to look. Elizabeth had always been recorded as a resident of the 8th arrondissement. Her address, her earlier paperwork, her registration, everything pointed to District 8. Naturally, every researcher and every archivist searched there. Elizabeth began in the 8th, but she died in the 9th, quietly, without anyone noticing. Her paperwork moved silently during Paris' administrative reshuffle, yet everyone kept searching in the place where she used to be registered, where, according to all existing documentation, she was still registered. No one searched where Elizabeth was actually filed at the time of her death. They followed the house, not the woman. That single shift kept the key document out of sight for more than a century. After going through the archives, one ledger at a time, Gianna found the missing document. It had simply drifted across an arrondissement boundary. And there it was, the official act dated 15th July 1887. If she had been a drinker, she would have opened a bottle of wine and celebrated her findings. And with this, Lizzie's lifelong account, dismissed for generations as hearsay, has finally been validated. The act in which not just Louis, but Louis and Lizzie together transferred his entire share of the family home to his brother Albert had finally surfaced. It had lain dormant, waiting for someone who would not give up and would dig deep enough to find it. With that document, Albert now became the sole owner of their mother's property. Under the agreement between the brothers, Albert would sell these assets and use the proceeds to pay Louis his share of 60,000 francs. Once that was done, Albert would remain the owner of a Parisian house worth close to 200,000 francs. For Albert, it was an extremely favourable arrangement. All he had to do was settle the financial part with Louis, and the house would stand entirely in his name. But Albert never paid, and the reason why has now become a mystery all by itself. Before we continue, I quickly need to correct something. See, Gianna originally thought Elizabeth lent Adolphe money, but when she requested the documents from the French archives because she was curious why Adolphe would need this money, she found out it was actually the other way around. Adolphe is the one who lent Elizabeth 20,000 francs to pay the remainder of the house she bought. The house costed not 129,600 francs, but 149,600 francs. It was a brand new building. Elizabeth was the first occupant, one of the first buildings to actually have gas, and the last part of the price was only due when the property was finished and she received the key. That's what the 20,000 francs was for. Louis sold his share, and Albert became the sole owner of the Boulabert house on Rue de Bochard de Saron. Back in those days, you didn't just sell a property like that. A house was more than an address. It was an inheritance, a family base, a little piece of security in a world that changed fast. Friends might visit, relatives might need a place to stay, and if you wanted a bit of extra income, you could always rent out the upper floors. After 2 decades, though, the place would have started to feel a little old-fashioned. Albert may just as well have been looking to sell the property altogether. After all, living in Dijon, he might not have wanted the extra hassle of managing a Paris house from afar. Thanks to the French archives and the death certificate of Elizabeth Boulabert, we can finally place Uncle Adolphe at that address, 6 Rue Bochard de Saron, in the year 1887. And that single detail changes everything. Because now, for the first time, we can begin to trace the footsteps of Louis himself when he returned to Paris 3 years later. Before we go any further, after digging through countless records, I think I can finally sketch the 2 brothers. 2 men, 2 brilliant minds. Louis, the inventor, the artist, the dreamer. Albert, the engineer, the strategist, the man of order. Albert grew up in the shadow of a father he adored, a man of duty who died with honor. When his father fell, Albert was just 15, but he stepped into that role without hesitation. From that moment on, he became the responsible one, the one who thought ahead. If life were a chessboard, Albert was already playing 3 moves in advance. He was clean, precise, the kind of man who didn't lie, not even for family. His wedding papers tell the story better than any photograph. Every witness at that ceremony carried weight. 1 banker, 2 doctors, and his brother listed as a manufacturer. He didn't choose friends lightly. He chose pillars of society. Albert craved respect, and in return he gave it. If he ever sat at a poker table, he'd have had the calmest face in the room. But Albert didn't gamble. He built railways, he built bridges, he built reputation. Honor came first, family second. And if you tried to tarnish his name, you'd find yourself facing a duel you wouldn't win, because Albert le Prince was raised by a soldier, and he fought like one too. So I think we can say it without hesitation. Albert le Prince knew how to handle a pistol. And if someone ever forced him into a duel, you wouldn't bet against the man who built bridges in the wild and grew up under a soldier's roof. Albert le Prince was a civil engineer in the age when France was stitching itself together with iron and stone. The country was in the middle of a railway boom, new lines pushing south toward Lyon, east into Burgundy, and beyond Dijon toward Switzerland. Engineers, like Albert, were the backbone of that transformation. He would have spent his days on the move, standing on riverbanks with survey rods, pacing through quarries, studying soil density, calculating how to span a valley without collapsing a budget or a bridge. He carried rolled blueprints under one arm, a pistol on his hip, and a theodolite in the wagon behind him. His work mixed elegance with danger. On paper, it was mathematics and geometry. On the ground, it was blasting powder, bad weather, and crews of 100 men who answered to no one unless you earned their respect. He had to understand terrain, metal, wood, and human temper, often all before lunch. At night, he'd lodge in small inns near construction sites, write reports by lamplight, and send progress letters back to Dijon or Paris. Every bridge and viaduct he signed off on carried his name in quiet ink. No fanfare, just precision. And in that world, discipline was everything. A single miscalculation could cost lives, a single delay could ruin a company's contract. That's where Albert thrived. He was the man you trusted to make sure the bolts lined up, the arches held, and the money didn't vanish. He wasn't just building railways, he was building order. While his brother chased moving pictures, Albert was literally laying the tracks that carried France into the modern age. Louis, on the other hand, wasn't just an artist or a dreamer. He was a precision mind, an engineer every bit as capable as his brother Albert. But where Albert built bridges of stone, Louis tried to build one out of light. He grew up under the quiet influence of his uncle Adolphe, a painter, a mentor, and the man who became the father figure he lost too young. Every year, Louis would visit him in Montpellier, and there, amid canvases and turpentine, he learned to see the world differently. Adolphe taught him how to mix colour, how to see movement even in stillness, how to understand the patience of detail. When Louis later had a son, he didn't name him after his father. He named him Adolphe, after the uncle who taught him to see. That blend of science and art defined him for the rest of his life. He studied mathematics, chemistry and mechanics like his brother, but he saw beyond their practical use. Every formula was a brushstroke, every lens a new way to shape light. He was a perfectionist, one of those minds that won't rest until the last screw fits and the last reflection aligns. The kind who can stay awake until dawn because he knows the problem is solvable. If only he had one more hour, one more test, one more franc. He wasn't reckless, he was driven. He believed that if you could engineer bridges strong enough to carry trains, then surely you could build a machine strong enough to carry memory. Lizzie later said it started with something simple, a toy almost, a small carousel that spun drawings fast enough to trick the eye into seeing motion. Louis watched it and thought, what if that illusion could be made real? What if pictures could move not by hand, but by science? That moment, the spark of the idea, bit him hard and never let go. But Louis was never satisfied. He didn't just want to make something that worked. He wanted it perfect. He chased clarity, smoothness, realism. His machines weren't crude prototypes, they were crafted like instruments, as much art as engineering. He wanted to capture life as it really was, and in that pursuit he became the artist who engineered light and the engineer who painted with it. Louis had already given up his share of the house. That part was settled. What remained was the waiting for everything except the house itself to be sold, so that payment could finally be made. Lizzie and Louis stayed at the Rue with Uncle Adolphe. Albert returned to Dijon, and the practical work began. The cellar was cleared. A cellar is a space filled with old, unused things, broken furniture, damaged canvases, tools left behind. But in 1887 it was more than just a dusty storage area. For Louis, and for many people of his time, clearing a cellar was not simply a matter of tidying up. It was a ritual. In the late 19th century, a common superstition was tied to cleaning out spaces like basements, cellars, attics, and storage rooms. These places were believed to hold on to the past, often the past of the deceased. For those left behind, such spaces could feel haunted, not only by memories, but by things left undone, broken, or unclaimed. It was about letting the house breathe, shedding the weight of death, and allowing life to move forward. On the 26th of August 1887, before moving back with Lizzie to New York, Louis took out a loan of 5,000 francs before he and Lizzie returned to New York. But Louis did not stay in New York very long. He went to the UK because he felt that he was being watched as he worked on his camera. That's where he would stay, together with his son Adolphe as his apprentice. The video has to pause right here for now. See, up to this point, Gianna may have already uncovered more in this mystery than many researchers before her. Everything presented so far is grounded in fact, drawn from documents written in ink by hands that have long since turned to dust. Because of that, a natural boundary has been reached. Rather than guesswork and assumptions, Gianna chooses to wait. Those records concerned she is waiting for have two unresolved questions. A payment of 60,000 francs that never arrived at Lizzie's doorstep, and a loan of 5,000 francs whose purpose remains unclear. A loan neither Lizzie or any of the Le Princes knew about. These papers may finally allow the gaps that have been left behind for over a century to be filled, not with theories, but with proof. So, for now, this is where part 1 ends. When those documents arrive, the story will continue in part 2. After 3 weeks of waiting, Gianna finally received 2 documents. The first was the long-awaited sales act. Louis and Lizzie sign over the house at Rue de Bochard No. 6 to Albert. And this is where things start to feel strange. Bear with me for a moment, because this part focuses entirely on the Boulabert estate money. This is also the point where some people begin to suggest that Louis did not simply disappear, but that his brother Albert may have been responsible, even going as far as to accuse Albert to have murdered Louis over money. That accusation has circulated for decades. Gianna will address that theory directly and disprove it, but not right now, here in part 2, but in part 3 instead, showing why it does not hold up once the financial records and timing are examined carefully. So in this sales document, Gianna discovers that over a period of 20 years, Elizabeth never actually paid back her brother Adolphe the 20,000 francs she loaned from him. Instead, she simply paid him 5% interest every year, neatly divided into regular payments. 250 francs per quarter, year after year, like clockwork. By the time Elizabeth died, 20 years after purchasing the house, Albert inherited an unpaid 20,000 franc loan his mother had never repaid to her brother Adolphe. That debt did not vanish with her death. The original loan still carried 5% interest, which now became Albert's responsibility. In effect, Adolphe not only recovered his money through years of accumulated interest, but Albert still owed him the full 20,000 francs and was required to continue paying 5% interest until that debt was settled. So the entire arrangement Elizabeth had with her brother Adolphe now quietly rolled over to Albert, which means that Albert now carried two obligations: the original 20,000 franc debt to his uncle with 5% interest, and a further 60,000 francs owed to Louis for the house, totaling 80,000 francs. This figure is frequently cited as money worth killing for, and it is precisely why it deserves careful examination. After the property was assessed, not taking into account the repairs and updates that were likely required, Albert's share of the house was valued at 71,500 francs. When adding the 60,000 francs he owed to Louis and the 20,000 francs owed to his uncle Adolphe, the total financial value connected to the house amounted to 151,500 francs. The property had originally been purchased in 1867, 20 years earlier, for 149,600 francs. One might expect the house to have increased in value over that period, but given its condition at the time of assessment, this figure appears to represent its bare value rather than an improved or fully updated one. The document states that Albert must fully pay Louis for the house by July 1892. Until then, Louis is entitled to 5% interest on the 60,000 francs, paid quarterly. 750 francs due in January, April, July and October. Then comes document number 2. This one shows that Louis pulled a move so fast the ink barely had time to dry on the Sales Act. The first document is signed on July 15th. On August 26th, just 6 weeks later, Louis takes out a 5,000 franc loan, using that very same house deed document as collateral. The original paperwork of the house, the one that Louis, Lizzie and Albert signed, gets handed over to a notary that belongs to a Mr. Pierre de Maison. This happens at the same notary's office the sale of the house from Louis to Albert was arranged. At this point, this is what would have happened. The notary realizes this directly concerns Albert, since it involves the deed of the house sale. He calls an errand boy and tells him to run the message to the telegraph office. The telegraph clicks and whirs, and off the message goes to Dijon. The errand boy would have rung the doorbell. Albert opens the door, reads the telegram. He pays the errand boy said there was no reply, and slammed the door with maybe a little too much force. The next day, Albert sends a response making an appointment before the first term of 5% interest was due to be paid by Louis to de Maison. 3 weeks later, Albert is on his way to Paris. When Albert arrived at Rue de Bochard, number 6, he would have not been in the best of moods. The lender, Pierre de Maison, along with his notary and the original deed, as well as Louis himself, were subsequently summoned to the notary's office, where both deeds were signed, to address the matter formally. At the notary's office, Albert goes straight into damage control. Let me explain what Louis had done exactly. Louis had put the house deed up as collateral. If Louis failed to repay de Maison 5% interest after 3 months, de Maison could legally collect the money from Albert, because Albert still owed Louis 60,000 francs, and de Maison's notary now held the original deed. Louis had already taken 5,000 francs from de Maison. The money was handed over immediately, cash in hand. And since Louis was working on his camera in Paris, chances were that some would be gone quickly. What remained was the obligation, 5% interest, payable quarterly. De Maison's contract stated that the full amount had to be repaid in 1892. The same day, the 60,000 francs from the house sale were scheduled to be paid to Louis and Lizzie. That was the plan, at least on paper. Albert immediately saw the danger. The sales deed was now in the hands of someone it should not have been. And once a deed starts moving outside the family and its notary, control begins to slip. Albert likely pictured a future where unknown creditors would be knocking on his door, waving that same document. So Albert acted without argument and without turning it into a family dispute. He simply stopped the process. Albert was not willing to let anything involving their mother's house proceed without oversight. By adding the new clause, the remaining 55,000 francs was still due in 1892, and until that date Louis would receive his 5% interest. But Albert now also retained the option to repay the remaining balance earlier, provided Louis agreed. This allowed Albert to immediately settle the de Maison loan, recover the house deed, and return it to Louis through the notarial system. On top of that, Louis could decide if he wanted cash money from time to time quarterly or 5% interest up to 1892. De Maison agreed. Louis agreed. Albert protected the reputation of the Le Prince and quietly prevented a manageable problem from becoming a public one. This is the moment where Gianna finally sees the 5% interest pattern. Suddenly it explains why Elizabeth never repaid her brother, why Albert never mortgaged the house for 80,000 francs to pay off both his uncle Adolphe and Louis, and why the 5% interest kept flowing while the 60,000 francs were not due until 1892. It all made sense now. This wasn't a failure to repay. This was the system. You did not sell what fed the family. You lived off interest. And if you lived off interest and rent paid by others, you never truly had to work a day in your life, unless you chose to. Adolphe lived in Elizabeth's house, but he was not listed as a tenant because he was not one. He had, in effect, purchased his place there. Elizabeth paid him 5% interest on the 20,000 francs she owed him, which Adolphe either paid back as rent or offset by covering household expenses. With 2 additional rental properties of his own, Adolphe lived very comfortably. Meanwhile, Adolphe collected rent from the other tenants at Rue de Saron for his sister. He maintained the building using that rental income, and any surplus was reinvested, bonds, stocks, anything that produced steady interest and could be drawn on in case of emergencies. Albert and Louis grew up inside this system. They knew it intimately. So Adolphe was never meant to be paid back by Albert. He would simply continue living in the house, maintaining it, just as he had done while his sister was alive, and just would live of that 5%. There was also a long-term certainty built into this system. Adolphe was unmarried and had no children. When he died, his inheritance would pass to Albert and Louis. Once that happened, the remaining obligations would dissolve, and both brothers would be financially secure without having to sell all the houses. Let the stones make money for you. And then Louis broke the system. He did not want interest. He wanted the money. All of it by 1892. 8 days before the de Maison loan for 5,000 francs was finalized, Louis wrote Lizzie from Paris. In that letter, Louis explains exactly why he needed the money. He was redesigning his camera system. He returned to his original technical concept, requiring specialized light sources. The notarial document with de Maison does not explain why he needed money, but the letter to Lizzie did. Louis had already been in Paris for an extended period. His mother was ill, and he stayed with her until her death. He remained in the city while the estate paperwork was finalized, yet even then, Louis never stopped working on his camera. Lizzie was present to sign the documents, but returned to New York without him. Gianna believes the family likely treated the stay as a summer period abroad, particularly since Lizzie, who taught at the Institute for the Deaf, would have been on summer break. When Louis finally left for New York, he felt watched there. Industrial spies, he believed. He and Lizzie agreed he would return to Leeds, and son Adolphe, named after Uncle Adolphe, would come as an apprentice. They would stay with Lizzie's father. For just 1 year or so, they thought. By the time Leeds Bridge was filmed in 1888, he was already deeply in debt. There was no room for prolonged failure. He filmed Leeds Bridge with a single-lens camera and patented that camera in the United Kingdom. He did not patent it in the United States. That omission would later ignite a war between Lizzie and Thomas Edison over invention and credit. Things were at its worst when Louis receives a writ in October 1888, a summons for bad debt. The missing reel documentary actually held up this document, so Gianna made a screenshot. £607, 7 shillings and 4 pence. Today, this amount would roughly equal about $125,000. Louis begins paying his debt in quarterly installments. The payments align perfectly with the 5% interest schedule he gets from France. December the 6th, 1888, £10, January, £7 and 10 shillings. April the 17th, the same amount. August 3rd also aligns with the payment window. Then Louis sends his son back to New York to help Lizzie set up a showing, after which a payment of £11 and 5 shillings follows. And then the complete silence. No payment on January 1890, nor April 1890, or July 1890. In September, he will get on the boat to France. He now missed 3 payments. There is one weird payment left. November 25th, in 1891, someone paid £2 and 5 shillings. It is strange because we're now 14 months after Louis has disappeared, and someone made a small payment as if there was still hope he would return. In a letter dated April 25th, 1890, Louis writes that he is still working in Leeds. A belt breaks. The machine cannot restart. He calls it a serious trial. He wants to send money home, but has none. He worries about Lizzie's health. He worries about rest. He worries about everything. The next thing the letters to Lizzie reveal is that Louis had finally reached the finish line. Lizzie had already secured a place in New York, the Jumel Mansion, where Louis could present his moving pictures. Before continuing on to New York, Louis intended to make a brief stop in Dijon, tied to matters concerning the Boulebert estate. And here is the assumption everyone made, that Louis went huffing and puffing to Dijon to claim his 55,000 francs. In reality, nothing of the sort happened. What happened instead was this. Before Louis would have stepped in front of an audience at the Jumel Mansion, you need to understand that this first showing was not a public event. There were no tickets, no advertising, no box office. It was a private demonstration for investors, arranged through word of mouth by Lizzie and Louis. And that kind of evening had to look effortless, even though nothing about it was. The equipment alone had to cross the Atlantic, fragile, experimental, irreplaceable. It needed to be packed, insured, handled carefully at every port. Once in New York, the room had to be prepared, light controlled, chairs rented and delivered so guests could sit comfortably instead of lining the walls, wondering whether this was a serious invention or a parlour trick. There would be food and drinks, not luxury, but hospitality. Staff had to be paid. Spare film and backup parts had to be on hand, because one failure in front of investors could end the conversation before it began. And Louis himself could not arrive looking underfunded. He needed lodging, proper clothes, and the freedom to focus on the presentation, not on counting coins. Albert promised he would pay before 1892, and Louis probably already let him know ahead of time he would need this money. This time, not des maisons, but Dijon. Albert would have had the money ready, and likely with pride. His brother had finally reached the finish line. There would have been no argument from Albert's side. By the end of that year, he was about to be known as the brother of Louis Le Prince, the inventor of motion pictures. That alone should already tell you why the idea that Albert killed him makes no sense. But if that is still not convincing, Diana will address it directly in part 3, alongside the other assumptions that have followed Louis for more than a century. And there she will also present her own theory of what may have happened to Louis during that September of 1890. And if she is correct, there is a chance he may still be found, even in death, 136 years after he disappeared. And that chance balances on if he used an alias, or if he had someone else's business card in his pocket. In Part 3, Gianna will start with the trip from Leeds to Dijon. Hope to see you there. This was supposed to be the last episode, but the brothers seem to take Gianna from revelation to revelation, so she follows. Would be rude not to, right? When we arrive at 1890, we find the two brothers hard at work, but on completely different trajectories. Albert's path is almost textbook. He starts as a civil engineer in the railway business, working with infrastructure, bridges and systems that have to hold. After his marriage, and with the influence and network of his father-in-law, he transitions into architecture. From there, his career moves steadily upward. Architect becomes engineer-architect, meaning he is no longer just designing but overseeing entire projects. By the time he dies, his official title is Ingénieur des Arts et Manufactures, a senior industrial engineer. Albert's career is a straight line, deliberate, stable and relentlessly upward. Louis, on the other hand, is all over the map. He begins with engineering work for the Whitley Company, then co-founds an art institute. From there, he experiments with photography on pottery, literally fixing images onto ceramic surfaces. Impressive enough that it earns him the commission to place the Queen's portrait on a plate. For most people, that would be the pinnacle. For Louis, it is the ceiling. And when the ceiling appears, he gets restless and he moves on to a new project. He moves on to panoramas, massive painted immersive images, not as an end goal, but as a way to understand scale, immersion, and how the human eye experiences a scene. Once he understands it, the ceiling appears again, and he moves on. As Louis pursued new ideas and pushed forward into uncharted territory, there were periods where progress depended less on invention and more on stability. During those times, Lizzie's steady income at the Art Institute quietly made it possible for him to continue, providing the financial breathing room that kept everything from falling apart. Louis had spent his life mastering systems and then moving on once the ceiling appeared. But the idea of a moving picture camera was different. For the first time, the problem wasn't easily solved. He found a real challenge he couldn't walk away from. As Albert builds his career, Louis chases unanswered problems. One brother climbs in a straight line, the other zigzags toward the future. And by 1890, those two approaches are about to join up one last time. But before any of that, Mr. Wilson invited Louis to accompany him and his wife on a trip to France. He needed someone who could translate, and Louis was both capable and trusted. Their friendship stretched back more than 15 years. Beyond that personal bond, Mr. Wilson was a banker who managed Louis's financial affairs. He also held several of Louis's paintings some commissioned, others possibly acquired to help Louis financially, though the exact circumstances remain unclear. Late August, the three went on the trip to Paris. The trip went something like this. Louis leaves Leeds early in the morning, probably first train around 5 a.m. Mid-morning, he arrives in London, where he meets up with his friends, where they board the train to Dover. The route to Dover takes another 2 hours or so. They get to the port sometime after 1 p.m. The next ferry leaves within the hour, and by mid-afternoon they are crossing the Channel. They arrive between 4 and 5 p.m. local time. From there they get on the main line to Paris. They don't have to wait too long after they arrive. Trains ran on boat schedules to take people to the big cities, of which Paris is roughly a 5-hour journey. They roll into the Gare du Nord about 8:30 in the evening. Probably extremely tired after nearly 17 hours of travel, and no doubt Mrs. Wilson can't wait to get to her hotel. Louis, however, he has his own bed at Rue Bochard de Saron. Letters would have been sent ahead from England to his uncle Adolphe, when and what time he would arrive in Paris. His bed would be ready for him to get some rest, and after catching up with his uncle the next morning over breakfast, he would have said his goodbye to join the Wilsons to go touring France with them. Uncle Adolphe would not expect him back before he left for England again. It appears likely that the Wilsons had planned a stay of roughly 2 weeks, with the intention of returning to the United Kingdom on Sunday evening, September 14th. At some point, Louis indicated that he needed to attend to personal business and suggested that the Wilsons continue on without him, saying he would rejoin them later in the UK. However, Louis had joined the trip at Mr. Wilson's request, and under the standards of the time, it would have been natural for Mr. Wilson to feel a responsibility to see that arrangement through. Rather than parting abruptly, it is reasonable to assume that Mr. Wilson would have been inclined to wait in Paris so all could travel back together to the UK, as such conduct would have been expected of a gentleman acting in good faith. Notably, had Louis intended a purely social visit to Dijon, custom would have called for an invitation for the Wilsons to accompany Louis and meet his brother. The absence of such an invitation suggests that Louis' journey to Dijon was business-related, a matter more appropriately handled privately and without extending the social obligation. Everything that now follows is guided by a single principle. When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. The line is often associated with Sherlock Holmes, and it serves as a useful framework here. With that in mind, we begin by identifying what can be ruled out entirely. Once the English Code of Honour, a long-standing friendship, and established business relations of the 1890s are taken into account. Louis' journey and final moments have often been framed as unknowable. But when we examine the depth of his 15-year friendship with the Wilsons, the codes of honour and conduct of the 1890s, and Richard Wilson's financial relationship with Louis, a clearer and more plausible picture begins to form of the final day. Louis left his friends, who would return to Paris that day, to visit his brother Albert in Dijon, where Louis arrived on Sunday, September 14th. The Wilsons later informed Lizzie that he went off to arrange estate-related matters with his brother. Mr. Wilson would have understood exactly what Louis was travelling to do. Whether through personal trust or professional responsibility as his banker, he would have been aware of the significance of the 60,000 francs tied to the estate, as well as the clause in the house sale deed that allowed Louis to borrow against those funds through Albert if necessary. From that point forward, Louis no longer needed to rely on informal or risky lenders. He could turn to his brother for financial support. This context also explains why a banker who might otherwise have distanced himself from a man rumoured to be heavily indebted continued to work with Louis, knowing that his financial position had been stabilised through family arrangements. In light of this, one is left to wonder whether the debts so often attributed to Louis were ever as dire as later accounts have suggested. When Louis arrived at Albert's on Sunday the 14th, the two brothers would have discussed family matters as well as the practical requirements for Louis's upcoming private showing to investors in New York. The amount needed was likely modest, but sufficient to cover travel-related expenses and presentation costs, plausibly in the range of 2,000 to 2,500 francs. Albert would then have gone to the bank on Monday the 15th to arrange the withdrawal. At the time, banks rarely kept such sums immediately available in cash, and it would not have been unusual for Albert to be asked to return the following day, once the funds had been prepared. On Tuesday, September 16th, Louis was expected to depart Dijon on the 11:37 a.m. train, with the Wilsons anticipating his arrival in Paris at 7:30 p.m. at the Gare de Lyon. Louis did not take the 11:37 train. A later letter from Marie Le Prince to Mariella, Louis's daughter, notes that Albert was called away that morning and that Louis waited in order to properly say goodbye, causing him to miss the first departure. Given Albert's profession and responsibilities, it is unlikely that such an interruption would have been trivial. An architect of Albert's stature who was called away on business would not ordinarily return within a matter of hours unless the matter was local and time-sensitive. It is therefore reasonable to believe that the delay was connected to Albert's return to and from the bank to secure the funds Louis needed for his exhibition. Financial matters between brothers were typically handled privately and not discussed in front of children or wives, which would explain why the precise reason for Louis's delay may have remained unspoken within the household and later unclear to Lizzie. On Tuesday, September 16th, around 2:42 p.m., the Le Prince family was present at the station for Louis's departure. Albert was the last to see his brother, remaining with him briefly before the train left. Whatever was said or exchanged at that moment was private, and not something Albert would have felt necessary to share in front of his children. It is therefore possible that this final moment involved practical or personal matters, whether advice, reassurance, or simply a farewell between brothers. Let us now fast forward to the Gare de Lyon. When Louis did not arrive on the first train at the Gare de Lyon at 7:30 p.m., we know the Wilsons assumed he had simply missed the train. Mr. Wilson, knowing the significance of Louis's suitcase, likely filled with cash for the exhibition, would have been aware that Louis was not travelling with a cheque, but with physical money. Mr. Wilson understood the urgency. Cash would allow Louis to finalise business quickly, without the delays or costs that came with cheques. Once home, Louis could immediately arrange for the packages with his cameras in it and other gear to be insured and safely sent to New York. Trains arriving from Dijon reach Paris at regular intervals, roughly every 3 hours. When Louis did not arrive on the expected 7:30 p.m. train, the Wilsons, assuming he had missed that departure, waited for the next train, which arrived at approximately 10:50 p.m. When Louis did not step off that train either, the Wilsons came to the reasonable conclusion that Louis had not yet left Dijon and had remained with Albert, safe and accounted for. Having reached that conclusion, the Wilsons then made their way from the Gare de Lyon to the Gare du Nord in order to catch their night boat back to the United Kingdom. French rail schedules were tightly coordinated, and the window between arrival at the Gare de Lyon and departure from the Gare du Nord was narrow, leaving just enough time to make the connection. It is also worth noting that in 1890, clocks across Paris were set approximately 5 minutes ahead to accommodate regional time differences. As a result, a small discrepancy existed between local time in Dijon and official Paris time. This accounts for the differing references to Louis's departure as either the 1437 or the 1442 train. The train itself was not late. The variation reflects the difference between regional timekeeping and Paris time. When we consider Mr. Wilson's conduct, a consistent picture emerges. He was an honourable man and a long-standing friend. But if one still believes the Wilsons would have left after the first train, the question becomes simple. What would Mr. Wilson have gained by doing so? As Louis's friend and banker for 15 years, Richard Wilson stood to gain considerably if Louis succeeded. Socially and morally, the host was responsible for the guest's safe arrival. You did not abandon a man you invited, especially not in a foreign city, and especially not when money and reputation were involved. Leaving after the first train would not have been efficiency, it would have been negligence. They were not strangers. They had known each other for roughly 15 years. That level of familiarity changes behaviour. You wait, you assume a missed train before you assume disappearance. That was human nature then, as it is now. A missed train was common. A vanished man was unthinkable. Mr. Wilson was also Louis's banker and financial intermediary. If Louis succeeded, Mr. Wilson's position would have changed overnight. He would have been associated with the man who invented motion pictures, gaining access to elite clients and higher social circles. Through Mr. Wilson's professional elevation, Mrs. Wilson would have ascended socially as well. They would not have merely been comfortable, they would have been upper class by association. So anyone suggesting Mr. Wilson would have said, "Let's go," after one missed train is ignoring how Victorian ambition worked. Waiting for one more train was a low-cost, high-reward decision, and crucially, it aligns perfectly with the mindset of the period. Paris could be dangerous at night if you wandered the streets aimlessly, especially in unfamiliar neighbourhoods. But major stations like Gare de Lyon and Gare du Nord were active around the clock. Long-distance trains departed late, mail trains ran overnight, and stations remained staffed, even after telegraph offices closed around 10 p.m. Guards were present, station workers moved constantly through the halls, conductors prepared carriages, porters handled luggage, mailmen loaded and unloaded sacks, and travellers waited just as the Wilsons did. These were well-lit, controlled spaces with authority, structure, and continual movement. Waiting there, late in the evening, would not have felt dangerous. It would have felt safe enough to do so. Once that next train arrived at 10:50 p.m., without Louis, only one conclusion remains. Louis le Prince did not arrive in Paris on the evening of September 16, 1890. And because he never arrived, he could not have been mugged, killed, abducted, or kidnapped in Paris. Every theory that depends on Louis arriving alone in the city that night can therefore be ruled out. The Wilsons and the Le Prince family remained friends long after Louis's disappearance, as later correspondence shows between son Adolphe and Mr. Wilson. The fact that the friendship withstood the test of time suggests that Mr. Wilson acted as would have been expected of him. There is still one puzzling fact. Why would a banker from England need a translator on a trip to France? By all accounts, Mr. Wilson would have learned French at a young age at school. Then we find the following. By mid-August 1890, concern about Lizzie's health was already circulating among Lewis's close friends. Sarah Addington records that she spoke directly with Louis shortly before sailing for the United States aboard the Phoenicia. She urged him to return home as soon as possible, primarily because Lizzie was unwell. Louis did not resist the idea. On the contrary, he told her that his affairs were arranged in such a way that he could sail on the same ship. This was not a man avoiding responsibilities. It was a man preparing to leave. A few days later, Sarah received a letter from Louis because you never told a lady to her face that plans had changed. When you did, however, you did it in the most eloquent French style of the 1890s, by letter, so you could carefully choose your words, avoid hurting feelings, and still make her feel taken seriously because she was. Louis would never have said out loud to any woman that he didn't yet have the money to make the trip. In the letter, he instead blames the apparatus not being packed in time for the sailing. Soon after, Louis accepted an invitation to travel to Paris with Richard Wilson. Officially, Louis was needed as a translator. In practice, the invitation solved a problem without naming it. Rather than offering money directly, which would have been considered insulting, Wilson framed the journey as a shared trip. It allowed Louis to move discreetly and with dignity toward the one place where his financial situation could be resolved. Dijon, where Louis could secure the money from his brother, and finally return home to his family. Pride among friends was preserved, and help was given without stripping dignity. And so, by applying the reasoning famously attributed to Sherlock Holmes, Once the impossible has been eliminated, whatever remains must be considered. At this point, the only explanation that holds is that Louis and his suitcase got off the train. In the final part of this series, we will continue that Holmesian process, ruling out Edison, Albert, suicide, and the Seine, and explore what most likely happened in the context of Louis Le Prince's world in 1890. Welcome to Part 4. If you made it this far, this is where the historical theories crack. As the hand of time finally applies the process of elimination, this story is placed back into an era where etiquette, gentlemen's agreements and class had meaning. Where men handled money, women were social representatives. And with that put in context, we now start to eliminate theories. Theory 1. Edison was involved in Louis's disappearance. Lizzie never accused Edison publicly, but her private writings and memoirs tell a more complicated story. This chapter examines the theories that came to surround Louis Le Prince's death, how those theories formed, and why some of them endured. The reason this belief persists is easy to understand. Edison walked away with the public credit for inventing motion pictures. But Thomas Edison was not an inventor in the romantic sense of the word. He was a businessman. What Edison did, again and again, was acquire patents and ideas from people who could no longer afford to continue their work on their own or pay for their patents. Lizzie Le Prince never accused Edison in court of stealing Louis's camera or causing his disappearance. What actually happened was a patent court case, not a criminal one. Louis's son, Adolphe Le Prince, was the one who testified and demonstrated his father's work. Lizzie worked behind the scenes, gathering documents, protecting Louis's legacy, and pushing for recognition. Later, in her memoirs and personal writings, she did express suspicion, but it must be understood in context. When your husband disappears and you watch another man receive credit for inventing moving pictures, the mind looks for meaning. Edison, powerful and visible, became the most obvious target. That reaction is human. It is understandable, but it is not proof. Also, in 1890, Louis Le Prince was not alone in the race to create a working motion picture camera. Several inventors were closing in on the same goal at the same time. It was a crowded, competitive finish line. If Louis disappeared, Edison was not the only one who benefited. So the real question becomes very simple. Did Edison truly need Louis gone? Or were there others who stood to lose just as much or even more if Louis succeeded? To answer that, we need to look closely at one competitor in particular, William Freeze Green. Freeze Green lived and worked in London. Louis and William would almost certainly have known about each other, followed each other's progress, and, most likely, measured themselves against one another. William Freeze Green even reached out directly to Thomas Edison, seeking support and funding, since Edison was known as the man with money, lawyers, and infrastructure. That tells us Edison was not seen as a man you feared. He was seen as a man you approached when you needed backing. Louis had played with the same idea, but his father-in-law advised Louis against it. Inventors did not vanish because of Edison, since Frieze Green lived long after Louis disappeared. However, many of the men working on motion picture cameras were either sidelined or simply outlasted until their funds depleted. Edison, meanwhile, allowed this to happen. He would swoop in and claim their patents once they became public, knowing they couldn't afford to renew them. That's how Edison operated. No invention he took credit for was truly his own. He simply used his teams of engineers to turn those ideas into finished, marketable products and take credit for them. If Louis Le Prince succeeded first, Edison would still have other patents and options. He had capital, he had lawyers, he had time. But for Frieze Green, the stakes were different. He had already demonstrated his technology publicly. If Louis crossed the finish line first, Frieze Green's position would have collapsed overnight. From that standpoint, Frieze Green had far more to lose if Louis succeeded than Edison ever did. But even then, Frieze Green was not the only one. This was a true neck-to-neck race. Several inventors were chasing the same outcome. Any one of them would have benefited if Louis suddenly dropped out. There is one more point that often gets misunderstood that makes people think Edison was involved in Louis's disappearance. People often remember it as Lizzie saying she saw Guthrie speak with Edison. But that is a false memory. What Lizzie actually wrote was that while seeking legal help, she discovered that William Guthrie, a man she had trusted and consulted, was also acting as Edison's lawyer. Over time, that discovery hardened into a scene that was never described, because the implication felt as strong as a witnessed moment. By the late 1880s and 1890s, William Guthrie stood at the very top of the American patent bar. He was not a casual legal voice, but a senior partner in a firm operating at the center of industrial patent practice. In that environment, personal impressions carried little weight. What mattered were active clients, conflicts of interest, and the preservation of professional standing. We could go into Lizzie's outreach to Guthrie and his later professional amnesia, but that story is not decisive here. William Guthrie was never a suspect in Louis's disappearance. And although Edison was a ruthless businessman who used patent lawsuits to crush his rivals, that alone does not make him responsible for Louis's disappearance. Lizzie's grief and her search for answers are completely understandable. Few things are more devastating than a husband who vanishes without a trace. One can still feel her grief in the record she left behind. But grief, however real and justified, does not make another man responsible without evidence. I will close this chapter with the words of Frieze Green, whom Hollywood later acknowledged, and who was also not responsible for Louis's disappearance.
There was a fisherman called Le Prince a year or so before me, who produced a camera working on a different principle to mine.
Theory 2. Albert Le Prince and the inheritance motive. If you have seen part 1, 2 and 3, this theory probably already sounds implausible. Still, it continues to circulate, and it is usually based on two claims. Albert was supposedly the last person to see Louis, and Louis had just sold the house to Albert for 60,000 francs. From there, the story assumes that money must have been the motive. This theory can almost be dismissed in 10 seconds. The entire Le Prince family came to see Louis off at the train station. Albert was not the last person to see him. His 3 children were there as well. Unknown to history, there is much more to the story. The notarial records reveal exactly what kind of man Albert Le Prince was. When Louis took out a 5,000 franc loan from a man named Pierre de Maison in Paris in 1887, Albert ensured it was fully paid off within a month. Furthermore, a specific clause was added to the deed of the house sale to prevent Louis from ever having to borrow from moneylenders again. Through these actions, Albert safeguarded the family's reputation and ensured that Louis would never face bankruptcy. From the will of Adolphe Boulabert, all 66 pages of it, we once again see Albert Le Prince placed in a central role. Adolphe explicitly demanded that Albert oversee the division of his inheritance, further confirming Albert's position as the family's administrator and patriarch. As was already correctly assumed in Part 1, Jeanne-Élisabeth Ricard and Jean-Augustin Boulabert did indeed have additional children. This expanded the circle of heirs and resulted in a significantly larger group of nephews and nieces entitled to a share, including the children of Louis and Lizzie Le Prince. That Adolphe entrusted only Albert with the execution of his will is telling. It reinforces the consistent picture that emerges from the record, namely that Albert was regarded as the family's stabilizing figure and de facto patriarch. The official documentation supports again that Albert was a man expected to carry responsibility, manage complexity, and act on behalf of the wider family, and the legal paperwork reflects that trust without ambiguity. After Uncle Adolphe's estate was settled, and despite receiving a share large enough to allow a life of comfort without further employment, Albert did not retire. Instead, he continued to work actively until the age of 72. A man who kills for money does not voluntarily remain in professional service for decades afterward. There has also been talk that Lizzie was discouraged from coming to Dijon and that Albert obstructed her, essentially telling her to stay away because there was nothing she could do there. I found the telegram often cited as evidence for this claim. It was not sent by Albert. It was sent by John, aka Jack Whitley, Lizzie's brother, and it was addressed to Alphonse, Louis's son. It instructed him not to come to the United Kingdom. The same telegram contains the statement, "Albert says Gus knows £1,000 due to him from the Boulabert estate someday." Gus was the name Louis Le Prince was known by among friends. Gianna seriously doubts that Albert would have discussed detailed financial matters with anyone outside the family. Financial dealings between Albert and Louis were kept strictly between the two brothers, and perhaps their uncle Adolphe. The reference to £1,000 due from the Boulabert estate is notably vague, especially since the house deed specifies a clear date, July 1st, 1892. The telegram does not align with how Albert handled financial matters, and the use of pounds instead of francs is by itself odd. One can reasonably assume Albert responded to Whitley's financial inquiries with a polite but firm "bugger off." Albert had boundaries. We saw this clearly in the de Maison matter. You did not trespass when it came to matters between Albert and his brother, especially not after his brother had been missing for barely a month. Whitley strolled straight over a line in the sand that was never his to cross. John Robinson Whitley met Louis le Prince at Leipzig University in 1866 and brought him into the Whitley household. Louis later married John's sister, Sarah Elizabeth Whitley, in 1869 and subsequently became a partner in Whitley Partners, a firm already weakened by John Whitley's mismanagement. In 1871, John Robinson Whitley officially took over as managing director from his father, Joseph Whitley. Just 3 years later, in 1874, the firm was so deeply buried in John's debts that he was forced to resign and flee to France. Louis le Prince did not flee. Louis stayed to clean up John's mess, in effect shielding Joseph Whitley from the public humiliation of a visible family bankruptcy. It appears that Louis loved Lizzie enough to protect his father-in-law from that outcome. By protecting the Whitley name, Louis was also protecting his own. Bankruptcy or scandal on one side of the family would stain everyone attached to it. It is therefore safe to say that Albert would not have thought highly of John Robinson Whitley. At some point, Albert must have asked himself if Whitley had set his brother up. Either way, it is safe to assume that Albert did not hold John Whitley in high regard, and therefore there is no reason to believe he would have discussed estate finances with him. There is one more Albert did it theory that needs to be put to rest. The logic goes like this. Albert said he placed a public advertisement in the newspaper about his brother, if anyone had seen him. People searched for it, they could not find it, therefore he must have lied, therefore he must have killed his brother. That is not reasoning, it is narrative desperation. Albert did not advertise in any newspaper because doing so would have been reckless, humiliating, and completely out of character for a man who handled serious matters through notaries, lawyers, and private investigators. Choosing discretion over spectacle does not imply guilt, it implies control. It is simply Albert being Albert, quiet, procedural, and unwilling to turn a family crisis into public theatre. What we do know from Lizzie's memoirs is that Albert hired a private investigator, a far more discreet and appropriate course of action for a man of his as well as his brother's position. Albert acted quietly, effectively, and with discretion. A Holmesian examination has now been completed with the help of archival records, personal letters, and a telegram on which the accusations against Albert were based. The so-called £1,000 debt, the alleged newspaper advertisement, the 60,000 franc motive, the claim that Albert was the last person to see Louis, and the assumption that Albert obstructed Lizzie's trip to Dijon can now be set aside. Albert did not kill his brother. If anything, time has distorted history through repetition and a readiness to jump to conclusions. Gianna begrudgingly and openly acknowledges that she was initially among those who did the same. And if Albert is looking down, one can only hope this work did him proud, and that he has forgiven her hasty rush to judgment. In the end, we have hopefully restored what Albert always fought for, to maintain his good name. Especially when one considers the burden that must have weighed on him, knowing that the disappearance of his brother was likely the only problem in his life he could not solve. Theory 3. The man that drowned in the Seine that looks like Louis. I know I said earlier that Louis never made it to Paris. If you're new to this case, there's one story that always comes up. A man resembling him pulled from the Seine in November 1890. Let's deal with that briefly. That photograph resurfaced in 2003 and was presented as though it were a new revelation. What is often forgotten is that the image itself has existed since 1890. It was already seen at the time by Louis' uncle, Adolphe, and by his brother Albert. Both examined the drowned man, either in person or through the photograph, and both reached the same conclusion then as now. No, not him. And here is how we know that. Lizzie later wrote in her memoirs that while visiting her brother-in-law in France, she carefully reviewed every detail of her husband's visit and his departure in good health and spirits from the Dijon station for Leeds via Paris. She was assured that every hospital, asylum, morgue and related institution had been inquired of between Dijon and Leeds. In addition to the family's efforts, 3 police forces were involved: the Dijon police, the Paris police and Scotland Yard. The response from Paris was straightforward. They could not find him. Are we really to assume that across this level of inquiry in 1890, no one ever saw this man's body or his photograph in the police records? I'll just leave you to ponder on that, but perhaps now this man that looks like Louis can finally be allowed to rest in peace. Theory 4. He was so far in debt he committed suicide. This one can be addressed briefly. Louis bought souvenirs for his children. He brought them with him and showed them proudly at the railway station to his nephew and nieces. A man planning to end his life does not take the time to buy gifts for his children, let alone display them with pride. His future was in motion. He planned to rejoin his family after one final stop in Leeds to insure and ship the cameras, assist his father-in-law before departure to New York, and settle outstanding bills, wages, rent, and possibly the £600 debt. That was the plan. These are the actions of a man preparing to continue, not to conclude. According to Albert, Louis left in good health and good spirits. Hardly the state of a man about to end his life. This was a man on the brink of becoming a household name, the father of moving pictures. The evidence does not support the suicide theory. Let's move on to the next theory. Theory 5. He was thrown from the train or fell off. Louis was travelling first class. We know this because Mr. Le Prince was not a man of modest means at that time, and first class was consistent with his status and prior travel. First class travel in 1890 typically meant a private compartment. If he wanted fresh air, the window could be opened. There was no practical reason for him to wander the corridors, and certainly no reason to leave his suitcase unattended. The idea that someone threw him from the train does not hold up either. There were too many people on the Tuesday afternoon train for such an act to go unnoticed in the middle of the day on first class. If anyone had fallen from the train would have stopped. Someone would have pulled the cord to alert the conductor. That is how rail travel worked. There would have been a disturbance. According to Albert, as he later relayed to Lizzie, nothing out of the ordinary occurred on that train. No one died, no one fell. There was no reported incident and no disturbance. Albert has proven himself reliable in the record. With the major theories addressed, one statement remains, a claim that has grown larger than life and is often repeated as fact without direct documentation or confirmation from the family. Let's examine where it came from. The statement, he stood 6'4" in his socks. Before we continue with what may have happened to Lewis, we must briefly address Frederick Mason. Mason was a young workshop contributor during the Leeds years. He worked with his father's firm, carried out precision woodwork for Louis his camera, and operated the boiler that powered the dynamo for the arc lamp installation. In the initial testimonies given after Louis' disappearance, Mason is absent. In the declarations at the City of Leeds in England in 1898, his name is not mentioned. Not by Wilson, not by Longley, not by G. Frederick's formal statement appears decades later, in 1931, when E. Kilburn Scott gathered recollections from those still living in order to preserve Louis le Prince's legacy. In that statement, Frederick remarked that Louis stood 6'3" or 4" in his stockings. Over time, that remark gained weight because E. Kilburn Scott, a respected figure in his field, repeated the claim. However, no contemporary document has surfaced that confirms this specific measurement. The statement has been repeated often, yet it rests on a single late recollection rather than written evidence from the period itself. Since no military or passport records could be found, Louis's own full-length photograph was tested using ChatGPT's built-in height estimation tool. Based on body proportions alone, the estimate places him around 177 to 180 centimetres, tall for his time, but well below the 6'3" to 6'4" claim. At that height he would have appeared above average, but not so unusually tall as to turn heads. It is rather unfair that Lizzie's 60,000 franc estate claim has been doubted for years due to the lack of documentation, while Frederick's 6'4" statement has been repeated without the same standard of proof. In Lizzie's case, documentation has been found to support her claim. In Frederick's case, no such supporting document has been located. At one point, the 6'3" or 4", since Frederick wasn't sure himself, statement even went so far as to dismiss the drowned man couldn't be Louis, based on the fact he wasn't tall enough. We already know he was not Louis, but that conclusion was not overturned because of any verified height measurement. We can neither confirm nor dismiss Frederick's statement. However, treating it as the gospel truth goes too far. Simple logic suggests that a man nearly 9 inches taller than average would stand out in a crowd. Someone of such unusual height would likely have drawn attention, yet there are no reports of Louis being noticed as exceptionally tall while boarding or leaving a train, or even while passing through public spaces. Therefore, we will continue examining what may have happened to Louis on the reasonable assumption that he moved through France, blending in rather than standing out. In conclusion, we arrive at Gianna's theory of what may have happened to Louis. Hidden in the records, we believe we may have uncovered an alternative scenario. It is not presented as fact, but as a carefully reasoned interpretation drawn from his letters, his physical condition, and the influenza epidemic moving through Europe at the time. It begins with the condition he was in 1890. Louis had been burning the midnight oil for years, with at least 5 other men breathing down his neck, racing toward the same finish line, all competing to claim the breakthrough in moving pictures. One photograph shows that Louis smoked. Almost at the finish line, he likely slept too little and lived almost entirely on stress and determination. But this was not simply an inventor chasing glory. Within the Whitley family, the structure had shifted. When John Whitley fled to Paris under pressure from creditors, Whitley Partners had to clean up the financial mess John made. There had once been a time when Albert stepped in during the de Maison matter and drew firm lines about how things would be handled. Now, with John Whitley gone and creditors pressing, it was Louis stepping in, steadying the company and drawing lines in the sand. One cannot help but wonder whether Louis ever noticed that he and Albert were not so different after all when it came to protecting those they loved and upholding the family name. In the meantime, Louis was hoping his camera would be the way to restore Whitley Partners to its former standing, securing Lizzie's future by lifting a struggling firm back on its feet. He was not racing against one clock, but against 2, one with rivals in an emerging industry and one steady erosion of the family business. Leeds was still the place where the responsibilities and stress weighed the heaviest. Age was taking its toll on his father-in-law's clarity, adding another layer of uncertainty. The workshop, the financial strain, and the hopes tied to the camera were all waiting there, demanding resolution. In a letter dated January 15, 1890, Louis tells Lizzie that he was exhausted and constantly worried. Worried about money, worried about whether Lizzie was resting enough, worried about whether his invention would hold. In that same letter, he writes that one of his employees had contracted influenza and lost a baby to bronchitis. He tells her that he himself had influenza and that it took longer to recover than other flus he had suffered before. The illness Louis and his family experienced was not an ordinary seasonal influenza. This was the Russian influenza pandemic of 1889 to 1890. This was a systemic infection capable of lasting damage. Doctors at the time explicitly warned that the first round of Russian influenza often dealt a heavy blow to the heart. In many cases, the heart remained strained and vulnerable long after the fever had subsided and you thought you had recovered. Medical literature from the period describes lingering weakness, irregular pulse, breathlessness, and sudden collapse during recovery. Today, we know that influenza can inflame the heart muscle, disturb rhythm, and significantly increase cardiovascular strain in the weeks following infection. To sum it up, we are looking at a 49-year-old man who smoked, who had little accessible money, who was responsible for steadying a struggling company, who was watching his father-in-law's clarity begin to fade, who had pushed himself relentlessly for years, who had recently endured the Russian influenza, who was exhausted, who was facing a High Court summons over £600 still unpaid, who was being reminded by Sarah Addington that Lizzie was sick and needed him home, and who, to top it all off, was guiding the Wilson family through long days of travel and conversation and attentiveness, because that trip was the only path to the funds that would finally allow him to return. The family accompanied him to the train station, where he boarded the train back to Leeds. Now Louis could finally exhale, and this is often the most dangerous moment. When pressure lifts, adrenaline falls, and when adrenaline falls, a body held together by sheer force of will can falter. Louis could have gone from appearing reasonably well, standing on a train platform saying goodbye to his family, to becoming seriously unwell within an hour or two of boarding that train. Symptoms may not have announced themselves loudly. Perhaps only a dull pressure behind the eyes, a heaviness in the chest, chills even in mild weather, muscles that felt unexpectedly weak, walking that required more effort than it should, slight shortness of breath while carrying luggage, a fog settling over the mind, a quiet sense that something was not right. Those kind of symptoms would make a man decide to get off, find a bed, and continue the journey the next day. In the late Victorian period, especially in middle and upper-class settings, visible public sickness could easily be interpreted as a lack of self-control or social impropriety. In first-class travel, decorum mattered. Men of standing were expected to maintain composure, control their bodies, avoid spectacle, and withdraw discreetly if unwell. Vomiting in a first-class railway carriage would not have been received with sympathy. Fellow passengers were far more likely to assume excess drinking or weakness than sudden illness. For a man formed by that culture, stepping off a train quietly when feeling unwell would not have been vanity. It would have been customary. We need to briefly fast-forward to Lizzie's memoirs, where we learn from the work of Albert's private investigator that no one collapsed in the middle of a street in the towns along the railway line. In that era, such an event would likely have been noticed and remembered. The absence of any such report stands out. If no one collapsed in the middle of a street, then this scenario assumes Louis made it indoors, that he reached a hotel, a rooming house, or perhaps even sought shelter in a hospital. He would have lain down to rest, expecting to recover enough strength to continue the next day. That night he may have fallen asleep, never to wake up again. Either he suffered a fatal cardiac arrest that very night, and that was the end of it, or he lingered for several days, weakened by a second strain of the Russian influenza, the infection settling into his lungs and turning to pneumonia. In either case, had he been able to stand, he would have made his way to the telegraph office. If this scenario is indeed the correct one can only hope it was swift and without much pain for Louis. We end Part 4 here, as promised, with the scenario Gianna believes most likely, based on the documented letters, the Russian flu pandemic of 1889 and 1890, and Lizzie's memoirs. Why he hasn't been found, we'll discuss that in Part 5. Why Louis wasn't found. Before we continue, Gianna would like to share an important discovery. She recently returned to the French archives, where enlistment records for soldiers have now been added. Naturally, she immediately searched for Louis, knowing these records could finally confirm or disprove something that had long been repeated rather than verified, and something she had questioned from the very beginning, namely Louis's height. For 95 years, Louis's height has been cited as 6'3" to 6'4", based on a statement made by Frederick Mason on April 21st, 1931, and later repeated by E. Kilburn Scott. This statement now appears inconsistent with official military records. Those records list his height as 1 metre and 83.5 centimetres, roughly 6 feet tall. With that, a 95-year narrative can now be corrected. Out of respect for Louis and his legacy, these findings have therefore been shared with the most prominent researcher in the field, as well as the keeper of the Le Prince files, his great-great-granddaughter. In the process, another important detail emerged. Louis was officially exempted from military service. Gianna also searched for Albert's enlistment record, but it has not yet been uploaded. It is also possible that Albert may have been registered in Dijon. Now let's get back to why Louis wasn't found. The formal search for Louis did not begin immediately. Several weeks passed before the investigation gained structure and reach. If Louis had died within a day, or even several days after stepping off the train, burial could have followed quickly, especially if an infectious illness was suspected. In that case, he could have been buried before Lizzie even realized he was missing. The process that followed would have been governed by the French administrative system created during the Napoleonic era. In 19th century France, death was a carefully regulated civil process. The Civil Code of 1804 required every town to keep official registers recording births, marriages, and deaths. Because of this system, even small communities maintain detailed records that historians are still able to consult today. When someone died, the responsibility to report the death usually fell to the person who discovered it. If the death occurred in a house, an inn, or a boarding establishment, that responsibility often fell to the owner of the property. A doctor would be called to confirm the death, but the doctor did not create the official record. That task belonged to the civil authorities. Within 24 hours, the death had to be reported at the town hall, known in France as the mairie. 2 witnesses were required to appear before the civil registrar, who was usually the mayor or a deputy acting on the mayor's behalf. In the case of an inn, one of those witnesses might very well have been the innkeeper. The registrar then wrote a formal declaration in the official death register. The entry recorded the name of the deceased, their age, their birthplace, if known, and the place and time of death. It also listed the names of the witnesses who had come forward to report it. Once the declaration was written, it was read aloud and signed by the witnesses and the civil officer. Only after this administrative step was completed could burial take place. French law required a waiting period of at least 24 hours before burial. This precaution was meant to ensure that death had truly occurred before the body was placed in the ground. Once the waiting period passed, the town hall issued a burial permit allowing the body to be transported by hearse to the cemetery. Each year, these registers were formally closed and duplicated. One copy remained in the town hall, while another was sent to the judicial archives. The law also provided procedures for situations where the identity of the deceased was unknown. Travellers, seasonal workers or wandering labourers sometimes died far from home with no family present to identify them. A body might be found along a road, in a field, or near a railway line or a river. When that happened, the discovery of the body was reported to the town hall, just like any other death. A doctor or local authority confirmed the death, and 2 witnesses appeared before the civil registrar. Because the person's name was not known, the record would begin differently. Instead of a name, the entry often simply read inconnu, the French word for unknown. The registrar would estimate the person's age and sometimes describe clothing, physical features, or personal belongings that might help identify the individual later. Even in these cases, the administrative procedure remained the same. The witnesses signed the record, the civil officer certified the entry, and the town hall issued a burial permit. The unidentified person would then be buried in the local cemetery, often in a section reserved for those without family. Because of the administrative system created in Napoleonic France, even people who died anonymously usually left behind a trace in the civil registers. These entries, sometimes marked simply as inconnu, are still preserved today in the meticulous books kept by towns across the country. Except for Paris. Gianna began searching the Paris death registers for one specific case, an unidentified man pulled from the Seine in 1890. But as she began searching through the books of Paris, she only found one type of entry. Inconnu, enfant sans vie. Unknown, child born without life. She kept searching, but there were no unidentified adults, no drifters, no homeless individuals, no drowning victims. Not a single unidentified man appeared in the Paris registers, which led to one clear conclusion. The unidentified dead of Paris must have been recorded somewhere else, in an archive of their own. Gianna found out Paris handled deaths a little differently from the small towns and villages of France. The reason was simple. There were far more inconnu deaths in Paris than in a small countryside town. Paris was a large city filled with travellers, workers passing through, drifters, and strangers who had no family nearby. On top of that, the city sat along the Seine, and bodies were frequently recovered from the river. So the city created a different system to handle them. When an unidentified body was discovered in the city, the police transported it to the Paris morgue near Notre Dame. There, the body would be examined and recorded. Inside the Paris morgue, the unidentified dead were laid out on slightly tilted marble tables. A thin stream of water flowed over the stone, slowing the process of decay. Some of the bodies still wore the clothing in which they had been found. Others were displayed with only a simple covering, while the garments recovered with them, coats, boots, hats, even personal objects, were hung nearby. These items were placed there deliberately in the hope that someone might recognize them and provide a name for the inconnu. If a body had deteriorated too much to be shown to the public, attendants sometimes replaced it with a wax likeness so that the person could still be recognized. The morgue had originally been created as a practical tool, a way to identify the city's many unknown dead. But over time, it became something else entirely. One of the most unsettling attractions in Paris. The archives of these people are found in the Archive de la Préfecture de Police de Paris. Unfortunately, they are not available online. It is, however, difficult to imagine that Louise's uncle, Adolphe, did not examine these records along with other possible sources, such as the hospitals of Paris, while searching for his missing nephew. Living in France and already retired, he had both the time and the proximity to follow every possible lead. Gianna has the utmost confidence that Uncle Adolphe left no stone unturned at the time. And if Louise's body was not located in Paris in 1890, it is unlikely that any record searched in Paris today will reveal what Adolphe did not find in 1890. That leaves us again with stepping off the train in a small community. Whatever the traveller had left behind after he passed in an inn or hotel would have been used to cover the costs. If there had been cash in the suitcase, it might simply have passed quietly through the innkeeper's hands. But the suitcase itself would still be there. Inside were the things Louis had bought for his kids. The small trinkets and souvenirs he had proudly shown his family at the station before boarding the train. The clothes, the souvenirs, the contents of the suitcase, as well as the suitcase itself, would be sold. The small amount of money raised would then be divided to settle the doctor's fee, the transport of the body, and the burial. Nothing dramatic, just the quiet settling of accounts, the way small towns often handled such situations. And once that was done, the stranger who stepped off the train would disappear into the local records. Would he have been buried under his own name? Possibly, if he gave no alias when he signed in to the hotel or boarding house. Lizzie's records state that hospitals, asylums, morgues and related registers were checked. It tells us the search was broad and taken seriously, not casual. We also know from Lizzie's account that Albert had the train Louis travelled on carefully investigated. Nothing unusual was reported. No man falling from the train, no recorded death, no disturbance noted by staff or passengers. However, if Louis le Prince does not appear in the death registers of the towns along the railway between Dijon and Paris, two final scenarios remain historically plausible in the scenario of feeling unwell and stepped off the train. As unlikely as this may seem, this scenario is not as uncommon as it sounds. It would not have been unusual for someone to notice a traveller in distress. If the inn or local lodging was full, a farmer passing the station with a wagon could have offered help, bringing the man home so his wife could tend to him. Acts of hospitality like this were part of rural life at the time, shaped by a strong sense of Christian duty to care for strangers. If Louis was taken several kilometres away to a farmhouse and later died there, his death would not appear in the railway town's records. Instead, it would be recorded in the civil register of the small commune where the farmer lived. The process would remain the same. A doctor would confirm the death, a burial would follow, and the event would be entered into the local register. Or, and this part is a bit more sinister, Louis may have left the station intending to reach an inn, but before he ever arrived, he could have encountered someone who saw an opportunity. Travellers carrying luggage were sometimes targets for robbery. If he was already feverish, disoriented and weak, it would not have taken much to overpower him. After taking his money and suitcase, the attacker could have left him somewhere outside the town, perhaps in nearby woodland or unoccupied field. Disoriented and alone, Louis might never have found his way back. If his body was never discovered, the administrative chain would simply never begin. And that is how a man could step off a train along the railway between Dijon and Paris and vanish without leaving a trace in the records. However, the search will continue, not just the railroad towns, but outside, not just September 1890, but a whole decade afterwards, to see if remains can be found. One town and one region at a time. This project began simply as an attempt to take a YouTube channel in a new direction. Instead, it led deep into a mystery that was never meant to be explored this far. Some questions, however, refuse to be ignored. They demand to be followed. And that journey has now brought us to an end. Although the idea he may have felt unwell due to a Russian flu presents a new theory about what may have happened to Louis, unless definitive proof emerges, the disappearance of Louis le Prince remains a mystery. And so this chapter closes, but the search does not. Louis le Prince may never be found. But as Gianna goes through the rail-connected cities records, she figured she might as well bring unknown individuals back into the spotlight. Maybe someone, somewhere, will recognize a description or a face reconstructed from those records. An ancestor who left one day and never came home. To be continued. In memory of the first father of motion pictures.
Un train partait dans la nuit claire, un homme portait la lumière. dans sa valise un rêve ancien, des images qui ne meurent jamais. Un jardin rit encore aujourd'hui, les ombres dansent dans la nuit. La course était déjà gagnée, et pourtant tu as disparu. Où es-tu parti, mon cher? Dans quelle nuit, dans quelle mer? Ton frère t'a cherché partout, de Dijon jusqu'à Lyon à genoux. Non, non, je n'y crois pas, la lumière venait de toi. Où es-tu, Louis? Où es-tu, mon cher? On dit des choses, on dit beaucoup, des dettes, des routes, des rendez-vous. Mais ceux qui connaissaient ton cœur n'y voient que rumeurs et erreurs. Car avant même le premier pas, la course était déjà à toi. Le cinéma naissait ce jour-là, puis le silence resta. Où es-tu parti, mon père? Dans quel chemin solitaire? Quelqu'un t'a-t-il pris ton nom pour écrire une autre version? Non, non, je n'y crois pas, la lumière venait de toi. Où es-tu, mon père? Où es-tu parti, grand-père? Dans quelle forêt, sous quelle terre? Sous un autre nom, peut-être un homme que personne ne connaît. Mais dans chaque film qui naît, ton ombre marche à jamais. Où es-tu, Louis? Où devrais-je dire que... Merci Louis Aimé Augustin le Prince, premier rêveur du cinéma.